Hi everyone, welcome to Talk Easy. Today Catherine and Mike will dive into modal verbs like should, must, and have to. Learn how to use them to give advice and talk about necessity. Let's begin.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into something that I think a lot of you have been asking about, which is modals.
Yeah.
And specifically modals of advice and obligation.
Yes.
Which are, they can be tricky, right? These are like the shoulds and the musts and the kapotes of English.
Right.
And, we've got a stack of articles and research here. And I think we should start, just to kind of kick things off, with modals of advice.
Mm-hmm.
Because the sources that we looked at really focused on three main players in that category.
Yeah.
Should, ought to,
Mm-hmm.
and had better.
Mm-hmm.
So, everybody knows should, right? Everyone's heard should. It's probably the most common and the most versatile.
Right.
But is there anything more to should than meets the eye?
Well, should is interesting because it's so flexible. It can be used for just a wide range of advice. Everything from like a very gentle suggestion to like a pretty strong recommendation. So like, you should try that new bakery down the street. Has a much lighter touch than saying, you should really see a doctor about that cough.
I see. So the context in your tone of voice really plays a big role in how should is perceived by the listener.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about ought to? Because a lot of the sources that we looked at mentioned that ought to is a little bit more formal, but how would that sound in a casual conversation? Like if you were hanging out with friends and you said, you ought to try this burger.
Yeah. That's where things get kind of interesting because you're right, ought to does have that kind of more formal, almost like a written English feel to it. And if you used it in that casual setting, like at a barbecue with friends, I think it would sound a little bit odd. Like you're almost lecturing your friends rather than just making a friendly suggestion.
Right, like showing up to a party in a suit when everybody else is wearing jeans and a t-shirt.
Exactly.
It just doesn't quite fit. So in most cases, it's probably best to just stick with should in casual conversation.
Right. Unless you were like intentionally trying to be funny or ironic or something.
Right. Okay, so let's move on to the more serious one. Had better, which a lot of the sources that we looked at said that it really implies potential consequences.
Right.
It's like, do this or else.
Yeah, it's got that stronger feel to it for sure.
But when is it actually appropriate to use had better?
Well, it's definitely more urgent. And it definitely carries that warning about potential negative outcomes. So you wouldn't use it with somebody like your boss. Like, you better finish that report by tomorrow. It would sound almost threatening.
Oh, yeah. That would not go over well.
No. It's more for like, close friends or family members when there's like a real risk of something bad happening if they don't follow your advice.
Right. Like, you better not stay up all night playing video games before your big exam tomorrow.
Exactly.
Okay,
so we've covered the advice givers. Now let's move on to the modals that express obligation. Must and have to. And again, I think most people are probably pretty familiar with these words, but what are some of the maybe less obvious differences between must and have to? Well, the main difference lies in the source of the avocation. So must usually conveys a very strong personal conviction or a sense of internal drive.
So it's more like this is absolutely essential and, I'm putting my foot down.
Right, like I must finish this painting tonight. The inspiration is just flowing. It's that kind of internal drive.
Okay, and then have to would be more about those external factors, like rules or expectations that are imposed by other people.
Yeah, like I have to be at work by 8 a.m. It's not really a personal desire. It's more like I'm meeting an external obligation.
So must is that internal drive and have to is more about the external pressure. I'm wondering, how these modals might play a role in shaping our sense of self. Do you think the people who use must a lot are more self-directed and people who rely on have to maybe feel a little bit more controlled by external forces?
That's a fascinating thought. I've never really considered that before. But yeah, it's possible. It's possible that our language choices could actually shape how we see ourselves in the world.
That is fascinating. Okay, but let's get back to some practical examples. One of the sources that I was looking at mentioned how even a simple sentence like, you must see this movie, can sound a bit pushy. Why is that?
Well, because must, especially when it's directed at someone else, can sound more like a command than a suggestion, especially if it's not softened by, other phrases.
Okay, so even if you're just trying to express your enthusiasm for a movie,
Yeah.
if you use must, it can come across as overly forceful.
Right. It might be better to say something like, you should really check out this movie. I think you'd love it.
Right. It sounds a lot gentler.
Yeah.
Okay, I see, I see. Now I'm starting to think about my own use of modals. Are there any that you find yourself overusing or maybe avoiding?
Well, I have a tendency to overuse should, especially when I'm feeling a bit, preachy or something. And so I try to be mindful of that and use other ways to express my thoughts.
I think we've all been there. It's a good reminder that even experts are constantly learning and trying to improve their language skills.
Oh, absolutely. Language is a living thing. We're all lifelong learners.
That's so true. Now, speaking of learning, let's shift gears and talk about negative modals, because I think these can be tricky even for people who have been speaking English for a long time. Must not and don't have to.
Yes, those are tricky ones.
Yeah, those were actually the ones that I struggled with the most when I was learning English.
Really?
Yeah. So,
Interesting.
let's start with must not. I know that it's often shortened to mustn't, but what does it actually mean?
Well, must not expresses a really strong prohibition. Like, this is absolutely forbidden.
So if I see someone about to jaywalk across a busy street, I can shout, "You mustn't do that."
Exactly. You're emphasizing that it's not just a suggestion, it's a rule that should be followed.
Got it. Okay, so mustn't equals forbidden. What about don't have to? Because my understanding is that don't have to means that something's not required or necessary. It's optional.
You're exactly right. It signals that you're not obligated to do something, but you can if you want to.
So it's about freedom of choice? Okay. Wow, I can see how mixing those two up could lead to some serious misunderstandings.
Oh, absolutely. Like, imagine a teacher telling their students, you mustn't do the extra credit assignment. The students might panic, thinking that they're forbidden from doing it, when the teacher simply meant that it was optional.
Oh, that's a really good example. It really highlights the importance of choosing the right negative modal because it can really change the whole meaning of what you're saying.
Right.
What are some other common mistakes that people make when they're using these negative modals?
Well, one common mistake is using must when have to would be more appropriate, especially when you're talking about external requirements. So, for example, saying, I must go to the bank sounds a bit strange if you're just going to deposit a check.
Right. Sounds like you're really forcing yourself to go.
Exactly. It sounds like you're imposing a personal obligation on yourself when it's really just a routine errand.
It would sound more natural to say, I have to go to the bank. I see. Okay. So it's about making sure that the modal that you're using really aligns with what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that I found really interesting in the research was the idea of combining modals to create even more nuanced meanings.
Right.
Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. Like, imagine a doctor saying to a patient, you must take your medication as prescribed, but you should also try to get more exercise.
Okay. So the must really emphasizes the importance of following the doctor's orders.
Mm-hmm.
But the should adds a softer recommendation for lifestyle changes.
Exactly. It creates a layering of obligation and advice.
That's fascinating. So you can really use these modals together to paint a more complete picture.
Right.
Do you have any other examples?
Yeah. Let's say you're planning a trip with some friends, and you say, we have to book our flights soon, but we should probably wait for the airline sale to get a better deal.
Right. So the have to conveys that sense of urgency. But the should is a suggestion to be a little bit more strategic. That's really interesting. It makes you realize just how much thought goes into choosing the right words.
Yeah.
It's like we're linguistic detectives or something,
That's a great way to put it.
uncovering all these hidden clues within language.
Right.
Now, one aspect that we haven't really touched on yet is how formality can influence our choice of modals. Because the sources that I was looking at mentioned that ought to and must are more common in formal settings. Why is that?
Well, ought to carries a certain air of, tradition and authority. Like, you ought to respect your elders. That sounds like something you would read in an etiquette book from like 100 years ago.
Right, like it's channeling the voice of our ancestors or something.
Exactly. And must can also sound very formal, especially when it's used in official pronouncements, like all passengers must present their boarding passes.
Okay, that definitely sounds more official.
Yeah. Whereas should and have to are much more common in everyday conversations.
Right, they're the workhorses of casual conversation.
Yeah.
So it's like our language adapts to the occasion. It becomes more formal or more relaxed depending on the situation.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. Now, speaking of common pitfalls, a lot of the sources that we looked at mention the danger of overusing should,
Right.
like, shoulding all over people.
Yeah.
Why is that such a problem?
Well, constantly telling people what they should do can come across as really preachy or judgmental. It's like you're imposing your own values and beliefs on other people.
Right. Like that friend who always has an opinion on everything you do.
Exactly. Even if you didn't ask for their advice.
It's exhausting.
It is.
So what's a better way to offer guidance without sounding like you're shoulding all over everyone?
Well, instead of saying you should all the time, try using phrases like, have you considered? Or it might be helpful to.
Okay, so those sound a lot less forceful.
Right.
They invite the listener to think for themselves.
Exactly. It's more about empowering others to make their own choices.
Now, I have to ask, how do cultural differences play a role in all of this?
That's a great question. Because modals often reflect cultural norms around, politeness and directness and the expression of authority.
Right. So what might sound perfectly fine in one culture could be perceived as rude or disrespectful in another?
Exact.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's something to be aware of.
So even though we're focusing specifically on English today, it's a good reminder that effective communication goes beyond just knowing the grammar rules.
It does.
There's a whole cultural layer that we need to be sensitive to.
Absolutely.
It's like learning the steps to a dance, but then realizing that different cultures have their own unique rhythms and styles.
I love that analogy.
Me too.
Yeah.
It really highlights how language is about so much more than just words.
Right.
It's a reflection of culture and values.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's bring it back to modals in English.
Okay.
Do you have any final tips for our listeners who are trying to navigate these sometimes tricky waters?
Well, one tip is to pay attention to how native English speakers use these modals in different contexts. Don't just focus on the dictionary definition. Listen to how these words are used in real-life conversations, in movies, in songs.
Right. Immerse yourself in the language.
Exactly.
Absorb those subtle nuances that you might not get from a textbook.
Right. And don't be afraid to experiment. Try using these modals in your own conversations. See how they impact the flow and the tone of the interaction.
So be an active learner.
Right.
And don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Yeah, that's part of the process.
And the more you practice, the more confident you'll become.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been really eye-opening for me.
But that's for me too.
I feel like I have a much better understanding of these modals now. And I'm definitely going to be paying more attention to how I use them in my own conversation.
Me too. Me too.
It's fascinating how these seemingly simple words can have such a profound impact on our communication.
Right. It's like a whole world of meaning packed into these tiny little words.
I know. Well, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder. We've explored the core functions of these modals, their subtle differences, and how they can be used to create different effects in communication. But as we've seen, there's always more to discover.
Yeah, there's always more.
It's like we've opened a door to a secret garden,
I love that.
full of hidden pathways and unexpected delights.
Beautiful.
So here's the challenge for our listeners. Pay attention to how these modals are used in the world around you. Notice the subtle variations, the different tones they convey, the ways that they can shape relationships and influence interactions.
Yeah.
And don't just observe. Experiment. Play with these modals in your own communication. See how these small words can make a big difference in how your message is received.
That's great advice.
Because as we become more aware of the nuances of language, we unlock a whole new level of expressiveness and precision. And that, my friends, is a superpower worth having. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of modals. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
See you next time. So much to explore with these little words, right?
Yeah, it's amazing.
I'm ready for the challenge, though.
Okay, good.
So must not. It's often shortened to mustn't, right?
Right.
But what does it actually mean?
Must not basically expresses a very strong prohibition. It's like saying, this is absolutely forbidden. Don't even think about doing it.
Okay, so like if I see someone about to jaywalk across a really busy street, I could yell, you mustn't do that.
Exactly.
Okay.
You're not just making a suggestion. You're saying, this is dangerous. There are serious consequences if you do this.
Got it. Mustn't equals forbidden. Now, what about
Yeah.
don't have to? My understanding is that don't have to means that something is not required. It's optional.
Exactly.
So you're not obligated to do it. But you can if you want to.
Yeah, it's all about freedom of choice. Okay, wow, I can really see how mixing up mustn't and don't have to could lead to some major misunderstandings.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine a teacher saying to their students, you mustn't do the extra credit assignment.
Oh.
The students might freak out, thinking that they're actually forbidden from doing it, when the teacher just meant that it wasn't mandatory.
Yeah. That's a great example
That-
because it really highlights the importance of using the right modal
Right.
because it completely changes the meaning.
It does.
So besides mixing those two up, are there any other common mistakes that people make with negative modals?
Well, a common one is using must when have to would be more appropriate, especially when you're talking about external requirements. Like, let's say you need to go to the bank to deposit a check.
Hmm.
If you say, I must go to the bank, it sounds a little bit strange.
I see. It sounds like you're really forcing yourself to go.
Right. It's like you're imposing this personal obligation on yourself when it's really just a routine errand.
It would sound a lot more natural to say, I have to go to the bank.
Exactly.
It's interesting how just changing one little word can really shift the whole tone and meaning of what you're saying.
It really can.
Now, one thing that really stood out to me in the research was the idea of combining modals
Oh, yeah.
to create even more nuanced meanings.
Yeah, you can do that.
Can you give us an example of how that would work?
Sure. Imagine a doctor is talking to a patient and they say, you must take your medication as prescribed, but you should also try to get more exercise.
Okay.
So the must is emphasizing how important it is to follow the doctor's orders.
Right.
But the should is offering some additional advice.
Okay, so you're layering the obligation with a little bit of extra advice.
Exactly.
That's fascinating.
So you can use these modals together to create this kind of more complex message.
Yeah, like more well-rounded approach to communication.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It's like you're not just giving orders,
Right.
you're also offering some helpful suggestions.
Exactly.
Do you have any other examples?
Sure. Let's say you and your friends are planning a trip, and you say, we have to book our flight soon, but we should probably wait for the airline sale to get a better deal.
Got it. So they have to conveys that sense of urgency, like we need to book these flights before they sell out.
Right?
But then the should is like a little reminder
Yeah, to
to
suggest.
be smart about it
Right.
and try to save some money.
Exactly.
This is really making me think about all the subtle ways that we use language to convey our thoughts and intentions.
It's true.
It's like we're linguistic detectives,
I like that.
uncovering all these hidden clues within language.
Yeah.
Now, one aspect that we haven't really touched on yet is how formality can influence our choice of modals,
Right.
because some of the sources that we were looking at
Yeah.
mentioned that ought to and must are more common in formal settings.
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, ought to just has this very formal, almost old-fashioned feel to it. Like, you ought to respect your elders. It sounds like something you would read in an etiquette book from like 100 years ago.
Yeah, it's channeling the voice of tradition.
Exactly.
And must
Yeah.
can also sound very formal, especially in official contexts.
Right. Like all passengers must present their boarding passes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's very authoritative.
it is.
Whereas should and have to are much more common in casual conversation.
Yeah, they're more relaxed.
So it's like our language adapts to the situation, becomes more formal or more casual, depending on the context.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Now, one of the things that I've heard people say is that you should be careful not to overuse should,
Right.
like, shoulding all over people.
Yeah.
Why is that such a problem?
Well, constantly telling people what they should do can come across as very preachy or judgmental.
Right.
It's like you're saying, I know better than you, and you should do things my way.
Right, like that friend who always has an opinion about everything you do.
Exactly.
Even if you didn't ask for their advice.
Exactly.
It can be exhausting.
It can be.
So what are some better ways to offer guidance without sounding like you're shitting all over everyone?
Well, instead of always saying you should, you could try saying things like, have you considered?
Okay,
Or it might be helpful to.
I see.
Those phrases sound less forceful,
Yeah, they do.
and they give the listener more space to make their own decisions.
So it's more about empowering the other person
Exactly.
rather than telling them what to do.
Right.
Now, this has been a really fascinating discussion about modals in English, but I have to ask, how do cultural differences play a role in all of this?
Oh, that's a great question. Because different cultures have different norms around politeness and directness and how you express authority.
Right.
So what might sound perfectly acceptable in one culture could be considered rude or disrespectful in another culture.
Yeah, that's something to be aware of.
It is.
So even though we're focusing specifically on English today, it's important to remember that effective communication goes beyond just grammar rules. there's this whole cultural layer that we need to be sensitive to as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's like we've been focusing so much on the technical aspects of these modals, but we can't forget about that human element,
Right.
the cultural context.
Absolutely.
Okay, so to wrap up our deep dive on modals, do you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners who are trying to master these tricky little words?
Well, I would say don't just rely on textbooks and dictionaries.
Right.
Get out there and listen to how native English speakers actually use these modals. Pay attention to the context,
Yeah.
the tone of voice, the relationship between the speakers.
It's all about immersing yourself in the language
Exactly.
and absorbing those subtle nuances.
And don't be afraid to experiment.
Right.
Try using these modals in your own conversations. See what happens.
Be an active learner.
Yeah,
Don't be afraid to make mistakes.
mistakes are part of the process.
Right. The more you practice, the more confident you'll become.
Absolutely.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me.
Me too.
I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of these modals now. And I'm definitely going to be more mindful of how I use them.
I think that's the key takeaway.
It's amazing how these tiny little words can have such a big impact on our communication.
That's true.
Well, as we wrap up today's episode, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought. We've explored the core functions of these modals, their subtle differences, and how they can be used to create all sorts of effects in communication. But, as we've seen, there's always more to learn.
Always.
It's like we've opened this door to a secret garden,
Beautiful.
full of hidden pathways and unexpected delights. So the journey continues. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.